The Man with the Golden Gun was released on December the 19th, 1974, just 18 months after the release of Live and Let Die, which was a financial and critical success. Roger Moore returned once again in his second Bond film. The Man with the Golden Gun still receives its fair share of criticism nearly 48 years since its release. But is this criticism fair? Tomorrow Never Dies was released on December the 12th, 1997, and was Pierce Brosnan's second outing as James Bond. Following the immense success of GoldenEye, a film widely credited with reviving the 007 series, the pressure was on to make sure lightning did strike twice. Out of Pierce Brosnan's 4 Bond films, this one is often neglected in discussions. Is that at all fair? I will be taking a look at these 2 underrated and much maligned Bond films to determine which one is best. I think it is clear that Live and Let Die was an unexpected success. It was certainly a great film, and the producers, Harriet Saltzman and Albert Broccoli, quickly got to work on the next Bond film. The producers managed to bring Guy Hamilton for one final Bond film, the same director behind Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever, and Live and Let Die. It is fair to assume that the producers wanted to replicate as much of the series' previous successes as possible, especially given the returning director for one thing. Roger Moore's second Bond performance had to match the greatness of his debut. However, his performance is markedly weaker in this entry. I don't blame Moore for this, rather the script is very much at fault. The script wrote Bond in the same way as when Connery was the incumbent Bond, and that style just didn't suit Roger Moore in this film. Moore never gave a bad performance as Bond. He's great during the more dialogue-centered scenes, but during the grittier scenes that ask more of the actor, Moore cannot quite deliver. I'm not sure why this happened exactly, as I felt Bond was written well for this new version in Live and Let Die. For some reason, the script has reverted to writing a Connery stand-in, when Moore was always going to be far better than just that. Britt Ekland often gets a bad press. I think Mary Goodnight was a decent Bond girl. I'd say this Bond girl makes Bond's mission harder than if he just worked alone. However, for comedic relief, I think Mary Goodnight works fairly well. The Man with the Golden Gun isn't an especially serious film anyway, and the more comedic aspects generally worked, though it was a mixed bag. Mary Goodnight may not be one of the best Bond girls, but in this particular film, I think Mary Goodnight slotted in rather well. Maud Adams makes her first appearance in the Bond series, but her only one as Andrea. I think Andrea is a rather sympathetically written character, but the film doesn't seem to put much focus on this. Bond in particular seems completely oblivious, which must surely have been a poor attempt at humour in the script, but whatever the case, it just doesn't work. It's possible that Andrea should have been the main Bond girl, as she is a far more interesting character than Mary Goodnight. Andrea also has a connection to Scaramanga, unlike Goodnight. Hervé Villachet as Knick-Knack is a fun henchman. He is certainly not a physical match for Bond, but this film is one of the sillier entries, and as such, Knick-Knack works perfectly. His relationship with his superior, Scaramanga, is interesting, and Knick-Knack isn't simply an obedient servant. Villachet is one of the best supporting members of the cast, and one of the most memorable aspects of the film. Clifton James returns for his second and final appearance as Sheriff J.W. Pepper. His appearance in Live and Let Die certainly surprised the producers. Clifton James was superb in that film, so I can see why the producers opted to bring him back. At this stage of the series, it was rare for characters other than the MI6 regulars to come back, so audiences must have been somewhat surprised to see Sheriff J.W. Pepper in Thailand. His appearance in The Man with the Golden Gun isn't quite as good as his original appearance, but it is still thoroughly entertaining. Clifton James shared a good on-screen dynamic with Roger Moore, certainly one of the most enjoyable aspects of the film. Christopher Lee's performance as Francisco Scaramanga is one of the best in the entire series. To have an actor of Christopher Lee's talent was fantastic, and a sign of how great the early years for Bond were. Christopher Lee was one of the greatest actors of his generation, best remembered for roles such as Dracula and Saruman. His role as Scaramanga is still very well remembered. It is a shame that Christopher Lee appears in one of the weaker Bond entries. I cannot quite imagine what things would be like with a much better script. Scaramanga has a great presence and is a proper gentleman. His cordial relationship with Bond would normally bother me, but as Scaramanga is sort of an evil Bond in a way, it does work for him to be such a gent when he interacts with Bond. It makes for a nice change of pace that this film focuses entirely on the villain. A great deal of credit has to be given for the locations in The Man with the Golden Gun. Thailand is a place I doubt many cinema goers were familiar with in 1974, and this adds to the escapist quality. It is similar to the sense of escapism You Only Live Twice achieved in 1967 in Japan. I like the more simplistic plot of The Man with the Golden Gun. It seems like a detour perhaps from the usual grander films, but oddly enough, this may be to the film's benefit, especially during a marathon. Tomorrow Never Dies had a terrific title song. It fits in well with the film and is rather self-referential. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. Tomorrow Never Dies often gets overlooked, and it certainly did have the difficult task of following GoldenEye. Pierce Brosnan is excellent in his second Bond film. His performance is much more settled than in GoldenEye, and he appears more confident as Bond. Things are very much down to business with this entry. Brosnan no longer had to prove himself to the public. He had already done that in GoldenEye. In Tomorrow Never Dies, Brosnan is absolutely fantastic, though his performance hardly reinvents the wheel. Michelle Yeoh as Wei Lin is a pretty good Bond girl. I'd say that Wei Lin ought to have had more screen time. This film is 2 hours long, but more screen time with Wei Lin would have added to the film, and I don't just mean the runtime. Wei Lin is an independent Bond girl who isn't reliant or used for comedic relief, unlike Mary Goodnight. For the most part, Wei Lin works very well on screen. Michelle Yeoh shared good chemistry with Brosnan, although perhaps Bond and Wei Lin should have avoided romance somewhat. Terry Hatcher as Paris Carver was surprisingly integral to the plot, despite not appearing on screen all that much. Paris is certainly most crucial to the plot in the first act, before Wei Lin becomes prominent later on. Bond's naval career isn't addressed too often, but it is always great when there is more focus on the Royal Navy. Tomorrow Never Dies is another Navy-focused Bond film, following on from the likes of The Spy Who Loved Me and You Only Live Twice. The pre-title sequence in particular is pretty good, and much like the film in general, is unfortunately rather overlooked. Jonathan Pryce as Elliot Carver is one of the strongest Bond villains in the series. While Carver is not a physical match for Bond, he is perhaps more of an intellectual match. Having a media mogul being the main villain has aged rather well, and also makes Tomorrow Never Dies stand out far more than many other Bond films. Jonathan Pryce is simply excellent. His performance is rather over the top and camp at times, and some may argue this doesn't quite suit the style of the film. I think to an extent this is true. But on the whole, Elliot Carver is an excellent adversary for Bond and meets a fitting end. Tomorrow Never Dies is very entertaining, though it does have flaws. Much of the action does feel rather generic, so it may not always be the most exciting Bond film. The third act does let the side down, unfortunately. The first 2 acts were pretty good, but the third act concludes the film in a rather clunky manner. Wei Lin, who was an independent Bond girl, is diminished to the complete opposite for portions of the third act. The good thing about Tomorrow Never Dies is the plot. It may be one of the most original plots in the entire series, and almost 25 years later, it has aged very well indeed. The film stylistically has aged somewhat, but that is to be expected, but in terms of the plot, it does feel like it came out yesterday. The Man with the Golden Gun came at a time when the series really needed a new spark, which it eventually got with The Spy Who Loved Me. However, at the time, The Man with the Golden Gun was not best received by critics, and was a bit of a financial disappointment. Due to this, the future of the series was in question. The Spy Who Loved Me was the creative revival the series needed. In the modern age, knowing that the series continued for years, is The Man with the Golden Gun any better? It is an entertaining Bond film, and I could hardly call it dull. Christopher Lee is one of the best actors in all of Bond. His very presence elevates the film. Had Scaramanga been played by a much less talented actor, the film would be far, far worse, without question. The Man with the Golden Gun ultimately suffers from inconsistent comedy and somewhat underwhelming script and poor characterization on the part of Bond himself. I would say that despite the very obvious flaws, the positives very much outweigh the negatives. Tomorrow Never Dies had to follow GoldenEye, which was always going to prove challenging. A Bond actor's second entry often marks a dip in quality before an improvement for the third entry, assuming the actor sticks around that long. Tomorrow Never Dies is not as good as GoldenEye, but is still a great addition to the series. The plot, or at least the premise of the plot, is what elevates the film higher than far weaker outings. The media empire angle is new to a Bond film and yet doesn't feel out of place. What prevents Tomorrow Never Dies from being an all-time great is the rather poor third act, and the direction in general does seem like something taken from a made-for-TV film, though scenes such as the motorbike chase are very well shot indeed. Tomorrow Never Dies can come across as a bit cheap, and this diminishes the scope and scale. Both The Man with the Golden Gun and Tomorrow Never Dies have utterly superb villains, but both films are somewhat restricted by the shortcomings in the script. It's clear that the reason these films often rank so low is because of the comparison with better entries, not because these films are bad per se, because they are not. They're just lacking somewhat. But which is better? It's very close, but it's Tomorrow Never Dies. Tomorrow Never Dies is the more original Bond film. It doesn't feel derivative of previous entries, unlike with The Man with the Golden Gun, which at times feels like a greatest hits Bond film of Bond entries up to that point. The Man with the Golden Gun is good and gets too much hate, but for this comparison, Tomorrow Never Dies comes out on top.